Good morning. It's so good to be with you again. I hope you are enjoying this winter as much as you possibly can. And this morning we're going to talk about the nature of covenant and how we might need to use covenant in our lives today. We begin with a reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 9, and God's covenant with Noah. As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Thus ends the reading. Now, there are some who will argue that the Hebrew Bible is the story of the rise of human self-consciousness. Beginning with Eve and Adam eating of the tree of knowledge and becoming aware of their nakedness, through the covenant with Noah and the rise of Abraham as the father of monotheism, the story relates how we are, as sentient beings, become aware of our own process of thinking. In the 20th century, this process culminates with Einstein's conclusion that the reality of an event is determined by the observer's relationship to that event. We might argue that the study of human consciousness has been the primary focus of every human search for knowledge. In his classic book on human experience, The Phenomenon of Man, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin names this process reflection. He writes, "From our experimental point of view, reflection is, as the word indicates, the power acquired by a consciousness to turn in upon itself, to take possession of itself as of an object, endowed with its own particular consistence and value, no longer merely to know, but to know oneself. No longer merely to know, but to know what one knows." If we apply Einstein's thinking to Desjardins' observation, then we must conclude that there is another self doing the self-reflection, what we may call the observer self, what you may have grown up calling your conscience. Desjardins goes on to describe this self-reflection process as a path to personal and communal transformation. A tool that is proven invaluable in this transformation is the covenant. A covenant is a promise, an agreement made between two parties. In the legal domain, a covenant is enforceable under law. In the religious domain, a covenant is typically self-enforced, with violations often known only to those involved. The Bible offers symbolic reminders of one's covenant with the deity. The Noahic covenant is symbolized by the rainbow. God's covenant with Abraham and his progeny will populate the earth so long as they accept the one God is symbolized by circumcision. The Mosaic covenant came to us on 2 tablets of stone. Even Islam picks up on the covenant with Moses. In Surah 2, verse number 83, And we remember we took a covenant from the children of Israel to this effect: worship none but Allah. Treat with kindness your parents and kindred, and orphans and those in need. Speak fair to the people. Be steadfast in prayer, and practice regular charity. In the world of Unitarian Universalism, covenant is an important element. Many congregations recite their covenant every week, much as we recited our affirmation this morning. And often when you join a group in a UU congregation, it will have its own covenant, attending to issues like confidentiality and cordiality in relationships and behavior in the group. Indeed, we hold out that we are not a creedal faith, but a covenantal one, bound by the 7 principles we affirm and covenant. We do not come together by what we think, but by how we will be together in the world. This morning I'd like to explore with you some ideas about covenant and explore ways that covenant can help us to transform as individuals and as communities. At the General Assembly of 2013 in Louisville, Kentucky, the Reverend Rene Rokotsky and the Reverend Genelise Doran Adams and Douglas Zielinski presented a pair of workshops about covenant from both a scientific and theological perspective. Zielinski offered some thoughts on covenant as a way to transform the physiology of the brain so that we can change our instinctive responses to outside stimuli. The basic idea is that neural pathways are established in our brain from prior experience which trigger a reaction to an external event. For instance, if you see a projectile coming towards your head, the neural pathway triggers a response to duck. Some of these triggers are instinctive. A maternity nurse will tell you that when one baby begins to cry, eventually all the babies will cry. Some triggers are learned, as evidenced by centuries of military training. The stimulus releases chemicals into the gap between certain neuron receptors, which launches the physical response. However, if we were to interrupt the release for a brief moment, we might be able to change the response. And over time, the original pathway falls into disuse and a new pathway comes into play. Zielinski's thesis is that by engaging in covenant, our outside observer can delay the initial response just long enough to effect a new response, one that hopefully will be more fruitful and sustaining. By creating a new neural pathway, we create a new way of being present in the world. Reverend Rokotsky presents the theological aspect of a covenant using process theology model. This model engages the congregation in covenant with the larger community. In the model, the objective of the UU community is free and open discourse and discernment. And we achieve these 2 values of goodwill and forbearance. We achieve these using 2 values of goodwill and forbearance. The presumption is that we will engage each other in a spirit of generosity. When someone says something that doesn't sound quite true to us, we will ask for more in a spirit of clarification rather than a spirit of challenge. Without this fundamental form of relationship, we begin to be defined by our differences and not our similarities. The point of forming a community like a UU fellowship is to project that sense of wholeness and understanding into the larger world. We can demonstrate that even though we do not think alike, we can work together in community to bring about a world where free and open discourse and discernment is the norm. When we are all free to speak our truths, knowing we will be heard, then we can find a path to social growth and transformation. The right to speak freely is a fundamental covenant of our nation. In fact, the United States is probably the most successful covenantal government in the Western world. And its formation was informed not only by the ideas of the Enlightenment, but also by the model of the Iroquois Confederacy. Our founding documents represent all the promises we as a nation make to one another as to how we will live together in the world. In her Min lecture series on covenant, Alice Blair Wesley writes, "Our freedom of speech is conditioned. Our freedom stands under judgment. To communicate creatively and freely, we must act in accordance with patterns of meaning we did not make, or else ruin the possibility of free speech." In recent months, it's become clear that the idea of free speech has been contorted to mean that those who disagree with the outcome of democratic process may pronounce their own truth. The process involves repeating a lie so often in so many places that a number of people begin to accept it as truth. These people are then offered as evidence that the lies are actually true. Words such as truth and justice are giving meaning that have no basis in reality. Indeed, reality itself begins to be called into question, and shared experience leads to completely different truths. Well, truth has always been a hard thing to discern. And even if we agree as to the facts, we often disagree as to what those facts mean in any given circumstance. Well, this is the essence of debate. However, all debate falls within the context of language, which requires us to have a common understanding of the meaning of words. And to ensure that the meanings of words are restored, we need to engage in public. As Michael Gerson recently wrote in the Washington Post, we must engage in reflection and rededication. We must rewrite and renew the social covenant that is our nation. As a faith tradition, UUs do not necessarily agree on what we believe, but we do agree on how we're going to be together in the world. And I say that is the place to start this process of reflection and rededication. The Rev Erika Hewitt is the UUA's Minister of Worship Arts, and she offers these words to UUs. To be a Unitarian Universalist means we'll never be done with the work of telling the truth about oppression, the work of resisting any laws, policies, or practices that deny anyone their humanity, the work of stubbornly seeking out the spark of the divine in each other, no matter what, the work of creating heaven on earth. And to be a Unitarian Universalist also means we're not alone in the work. We're not alone because of our promises to love one another. We're not alone because we are companions on the journey. We grow ourselves into allies, helping one another get free, because none of us is truly free until we are all free. And entering into Black History Month this year, I'm encouraged. After a year of pandemic and political turmoil, I'm beginning to see real change in the attitudes towards racism and white supremacy. In his sermon a couple of weeks ago, the Reverend Jim Coakley asked us to consider whether Dr. Martin Luther King's call for nonviolent resistance would be heard today. Or would Malcolm X's call for black nationalism receive a more welcoming ear? And while I believe both still have relevance, I also believe we are moving in a direction that is different from all the previous conversations about race we have been through. The power of nonviolent resistance is that it inevitably will incite violence on the part of those opposed to its cause. Now, in the 1960s, it was necessary for events to happen where media cameras were present, and then for the story to be told in a favorable light. With the ubiquitous media of the 2020s, we can immediately review multiple perspectives of the same event, and each can judge for themselves. What makes nonviolent resistance work is our ability to broadcast the violent reaction. More powerful than this media response, though, is the economic force that Malcolm X advocated. In America, we respond to the economic impact of events, and the Black Lives Matter anti-white supremacy movement is showing its economic muscle by supporting those companies that open themselves to all people. We see more people of color in advertising. We see more mixed couples presented as families. We see the employees of large IT companies demanding that their creations not be used to suppress other people. Corporations are withholding political contributions from candidates and parties that promotes falsehood and insurrection. The NFL has reversed its position on player protest. The NRA is bankrupt. Smart corporate executives are sensing a rising tide, and they are racing to catch the first wave. The tide is rising. And as it rises, we must look to redirect and rededicate our nation to the covenants we were founded on. Not the historically implicit covenant of power consolidated and white male landowners, but the forward-looking covenant of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. Life that includes affordable housing, fair health care and food distribution systems, and justice systems that honor the humanity of victim and perpetrator alike. Liberty that allows for the free expression of cultural values and beliefs, the free expression of religion, or no expression at all. Happiness that includes loving the ones you choose to love openly and authentically. Happiness that includes free access to the elements of life, clean air and clean water. And we must renew our covenant of free speech, not the politically expedient covenant of free speech that allows one to shout down the words of another or misrepresent them to some desired end, or harass a speaker through social media, but a free speech which demands that facts presented as truth be publicly verifiable. A free speech that allows each person to speak their words of truth and be heard for the meaning they bring to their words. A free speech composed of words and not dollars. A free speech that places more value on listening than on talking. It is time to rededicate and redirect ourselves to reforming our nation, our faith, and ourselves. We must, in Alice Wesley's words, act in accordance with patterns of meaning we did not make. We find ourselves in the midst of this winter, in the midst of this pandemic, at a time to reimagine our future. A time to renew our relationships with each other, with our communities, and with the universe. A time to gather the energies of growth and open a new covenant for living. We are embarking on what Amanda Gorman called an era of redemption. Let us do so in covenant with one another, with a promise of love and justice. May it be so.